Colleagues, friends, good morning from Vienna. Welcome to this webinar titled Public Sector Capacity Building for Innovation and Industrialization in Developing Countries. The webinar is jointly organized by UNIDO and the Science Technology Policy Institute, STEPI, with the general support from the government of the Republic of Korea. I would like to thank the panelists for accepting the invitation to join us today. And my name is Fernando Santiago. I am an industrial policy officer at UNIDO, and I will be also moderating this event. Before we start, let me just remind a few some of the housekeeping rules. For the participants, please keep the camera and the microphones closed during the whole event. But please use the chat function in Zoom to pose questions or to exchange views with other participants. We will select some of those questions and comments and pass them on to the panelists, and hopefully we can discuss have a good discussion in the Q&A session of the event. In the interest of time, we will not read the full bios of the panelists, but the bios are available in the registration website for the event, and you can have access to detailed information from the panelists. The esteemed panelists are kindly asked to keep the interventions within the time frame so that we have enough time for discussion with the audience. And of course, we are recording this webinar so for the purpose of material that we use for later activities at UNIDO. So the webinar has three main parts. First, we start with some introductory remarks by UNIDO and STEPI representatives. Second part is the presentation, the launch of the report jointly produced by UNIDO and STEPI, with case studies of Asian countries that have leveraged on STI, science and innovation, and industrial policies to achieve rapid industrialization. And we will have a discussion and reaction from the presenter. For the last part, a presentation on the Republic of Korea, the experience of how the country developed policymaking capacities, combining both a brief and historical perspective with some contemporary challenges that the country faces. And this is an experience that we usually see as relevant for other developing countries. And this is focusing on the policy capacity. Right? We also have comments by two panelists and, of course, the presenter. And the goals of the webinar, two main goals. First, we would like to shed light on the importance of building synergistic relationships between science, technology, innovation, and industrial policies. These are two integral components of industrialization and development more generally. And the second goal is, against this framework, illustrate how and why investment in government capabilities is needed to supplement the development of technological capabilities towards inclusive and sustainable industrial development. Without any further ado, I would like to now start the webinar. I would invite Mr. Hiroshi Kuniyoshi, Deputy Director General of UNIDO, to provide some remarks. Mr. Kuniyoshi, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Distinguished participants, friends and colleagues, good morning and good afternoon. I am pleased to welcome you to this online seminar on public sector capacity building for innovation and industrialization in developing countries. This event contributes to UNIDO's efforts to foster STI, science, technology, and innovation, and industrial development for the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 9. As you all know, SDG 9 is comprised of three important aspects of sustainable development: infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation. I would like to warmly welcome Dr. Hwa-Neil Park, Director of the Division of Global Innovation Strategy Research of STEPI, the Science and Technology Policy Institute in the Republic of Korea. Today, we will learn from joint research undertaken by UNIDO and STEPI. I look forward to our continued and fruitful collaboration. I also would like to express my appreciation to the government of the Republic of Korea for supporting our activities around STI and industrial development, including the organization of this event. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development recognizes STI and industrial development as powerful drivers of social and economic progress. Historical evidence shows that active STI and industrial policies are fundamental in promoting development. Some of these experiences are documented in the report, The Role of Science, Technology, and Innovation Policies in the Industrialization of Developing Countries, Lessons from East Asian Countries, which we will discuss today. Building on the experiences of a selected number of East Asian countries, the report not only illustrates strategies to address gaps in technological capability accumulation, but it also promoted the strengthening of policy capacities for innovation and industrialization. More importantly, the report discusses how we can link historical evidence to our current efforts to address ongoing development challenges. Digitalization, environmental sustainability, and resilience are three notable examples of those challenges faced by policymakers across the world. The symbolic relationship between innovation and industrialization has become even more evident during the ongoing pandemic. Countries with solid manufacturing and innovation foundations have been better placed to weather the initial shock and recovered more swiftly. This could have hardly been possible without government structures capable of mobilizing resources to facilitate and leverage technological efforts of firms and to align the efforts towards the agreed development targets. All of these elements provide strong evidence for the need to invest in policymaking capacities to foster STI and industrial development. The call for action to the international community proposed by UNIDO's flagship publication, the Industrial Development Report 2022, incorporates some of these considerations. To actively engage in building a better post-COVID-19 future, the world urgently needs to strengthen its industrial technological capacities. It also has other needs to improve policy capacities to design SDG-oriented industrial strategies to back the revitalization of synergistic partnerships with the private sector, and lastly, to support long-term investments in public institutions. Let us use this virtual seminar to discuss any emerging opportunities and challenges in these areas. I look forward to an engaging conversation with our speakers and participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kunoshi. Thank you very much for these opening remarks and, of course, for linking the discussion that we have today with broader issues around the SDGs and UNIDO's call for action as contained in the IDR 2022. Let me now, can I now invite Dr. Wanil Park, please, Chief Director, Division of Global Innovation Strategy Research from STEPI, to provide some brief opening remarks. Please, Dr. Park, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear Mr. Hiroshi Kuniyoshi, Deputy Director General, Mr. Fernando Santiago, distinguished speakers and panelists, and my colleagues from STEPI, good morning and good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to join this seminar. We appreciate colleagues from UNIDO to organize this wonderful seminar and to invite us to the expert meeting. I'm so glad to meet many experts from various fields and countries. STEPI and UNIDO has initiated the project at the end of 2020 with the support of Korean government, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Since then, we have discussed the structure and scope of the project, held discussion seminars and workshops several times, and shared the insights and expertise to tackle the issues that we face together. We had the urgent issue of pursuing sustainable and inclusive industry development in one hand, and another important issue of building capacity for emerging science and technology in the other hand. The two issues are tightly linked and cannot be separated because the science, technology, innovation are getting critical and strategic in terms of economic development, social cohesion, and national security these days. It is definitely essential to link the STI policy with industrial policy. At the times of sustainable development and twin transitions, such as digital and green, we are continuously asked to consider and to provide a viewpoint how to make both hands hold together. The role of STI in the sustainable and inclusive industrial development is well recognized and more obvious compared with in the past. Moreover, the importance and urgency of combining STI with industrial policy is more demanding in developing countries because they are in the industry development path simultaneously with digital and green transition. After our research and collaboration for 1.5 years, STEPI and UNIDO published a report. We have investigated the theoretical research for the role of STI in the industry policy and conducted practical case study on the subject for China and Thailand. It is really valuable to share the outcome and main result of the research with many experts today. Besides on the report, I'm also glad that Mr. Songchul Jung will deliver the Korean experience of developing STI industry policy capacity in the second part. Mr. Chung will give us deep insights and knowledge regarding the topic and cast a way forward we can move. Once again, we appreciate all participants for attending this event and look forward to discussing together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Thank you. Thank you very much for the remarks. Thank you, Mr. Kunyoshi, also for the contributions. And of course, we look forward for a continuous collaboration with STEPI. And of course, the general support from the Republic of Korea has made possible this initial effort, and we'll continue to work together. Thank you very much, Mr. Kunyoshi. Thank you very much, Dr. Park. So can we now start then the thematic portion of the event? We will start now with the launch of the report. And for that, I would invite Mr. Dong-Un Park, who is an Associate Research Fellow at STEPI, and also one of the main authors of this report, titled The Role of Science, Technology, and Innovation Policies in the Industrialization of Developing Countries, Lessons from East Asian Countries. Please, Dong-Un, you have the floor to share some of the main findings from the report.
Okay, I just shared my PPT. Does that look good? Okay for you guys?
Yes, I think, yeah, looks a bit small on my screen, but we can see.
Okay, so can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the title of the report is The Role of STI Policies in the Industrialization of Developing Countries. And thank you for this opportunity to present, our report, which was conducted, in support of UNIDO as well. Okay, research objective is to help UNIDO with policy recommendations regarding STI policies into industrial development strategies. And there are two components. One, in-depth literature review, and the second, empirical policy implications from the case studies. And for this report, I'm going to focus on these case study results. Okay, in consultation with UNIDO, we chose 3 East Asian countries, which are Republic of Korea, China, and Thailand. As you can see, Republic of Korea belongs to high-income country in terms of by income, and China and Thailand both are belonging to upper middle income country. And interestingly, ROK and Thailand, they have very high trade openness. Rather, China has a little bit comparatively lower trade openness. And in terms of high-tech ratio of manufacturing exports, I assume all 3 countries have high level with Thailand a little bit lesser percent. But in terms of innovation activities measured by journal publication or patent registration, Republic of Korea and China are doing very well. On the other hand, Thailand is doing a little bit lesser success. Okay, for the case study, we actually adopted integrative analytical framework adapted from Kim and Dalman. And it basically has three perspectives. The first one, dynamic historical perspective, and second, technology sourcing and market mechanism. And here in dynamic perspective, technology introduction stage means that a developing country basically introduce a mature foreign technology at this stage. And in technology internalization stage, developing country now understands, assimilate, and adopts foreign technologies in tandem with local R&D efforts. And in the final stage of creation, a developing country can create new technology and knowledge by themselves. So if you look at technology sourcing perspective, it basically look at two categories. One, basically there are measures to source technologies. One way is to acquire foreign technology, and the second one is domestic R&D efforts. So we're gonna look at the measures regarding these two categories. And the third, market mechanism perspective, they have two categories, one supply and one demand. Here, supply side policies are the ones that a developing country implements to strengthen science and technology capabilities. And the demand side policies are the ones that a developing country implements for the purpose of creating market needs for a technology. So it is very important to differentiate stages of technology development according to dynamic perspective. So let me just show the example of the Republic of Korea. So on the left side, in the lower picture, you can see a rapid increase of R&D inputs as the proportion of R&D expenditure per GDP. It basically there is a surge from early 1980s, and also there is a takeover, which means a private sector ratio inside this R&D expenditure is overtaking the public one from the early 1980s in case of Korea. And to the right, if you look at the R&D inputs in Korea, then there is also a surge with some time lag, obviously, between, if you consider the time lag between R&D inputs and outputs. So there is a surge in patenting activities in Korea, but at the same time, there is also overtaking here, which means the residents' patenting activities are overtaking the non-residents, the foreigners' patenting activities. So therefore, I guess when we differentiate between internalization and introduction, these two STI indicators mean important. And so here I dubbed two takeoffs and two overtakings in terms of R&D inputs and R&D outputs for differentiating stages. And if you look at the technology balance of payments over the time of ROK's industrialization, you can see clear improvement from 2000s in case of Korea. So here you clearly see the improvement. So thus, considering these factors, we decided to divide the ROK's industrialization into 3 periods. So between 1961 to 1980, and 1981 till 1997, or when the outbreak of the Asian economic crisis happened. And also, since then, we described it as technology creation stage. And in case of China, I don't want to go too deep into details, but basically in China as well, we can observe two takeoffs and two overtakings in terms of R&D inputs and R&D outputs. And obviously, it started from the early 2000s when President Hu took office from the President Jiang. And in case of creation stage, we wanted to divide between internalization and creation from early 2010s because there is huge improvement in terms of R&D performance in China. China basically overtook most of leading countries except the US, Japan, France, Germany, and so forth in terms of journal publications, not only in quantity, but also in quality as well. And now they are basically almost catching up with the United States. So thus, we actually divided China's industrialization into these three periods. So from 1978, when the reform and the opening up policy, to 2001, and internalization stage when the President Hu took office, and technology creation stage with from 2012 to present. And in case of Thailand, unfortunately, we only observed single takeoff and overtaking in terms of R&D inputs, and also, unfortunately, very recently from early 2010s. So if you look at the bottom pictures, obviously you can see the surge in R&D inputs, but in case of patent, especially patenting by residents, they are very minimal. So in this regard, even though there was one takeoff and overtaking, we assume that there was not meaningful internalization stage for the Thailand, though we basically decided to call the third stage as technology internalization stage because since 1997, the Thai government started to adopt a systemic approach to STI policies, and also they strive to implement many policies regarding them. Okay, now we go through each country. So first, Republic of Korea. So during the introduction stage, demand side approach prevailed with STI policies as a key tool for industrial and economic policies. And there was huge support from the high-level leadership. The reason is that at the time, with the situation against North Korea, the government was really focusing on accumulating defense technology capabilities. And also the government initially wanted to have import substituting policy. However, all the projects regarding import substitution were rejected by the US government because they assumed that the Korean government had no technology to implement those projects. So basically the government had this in mind. Basically, you need to have technologies for implementing any industrial and economic projects. And so, but at the same time, the Korean government did not have inherit any STI infrastructure. So for this stage, the Republic of Korea began to build most of STI related institutions, ministry, laws, national plans, GRIs, and so forth. At the same time, these newly established GRIs, they wanted to develop new technologies, but there were no demands from industrial sector. So basically, they serve the private sector as a contracting intermediary for sourcing foreign technologies. And during the internalization stage, this demand side approach continued, but they had more emphasis on SDI policies, and they provided required indigenous technologies to facilitate industrial upgrading in Korea. And at this stage, GRIs actually led national R&D programs in collaboration with the private sector, which means that they basically implemented the real technology development projects. So we call it they actually play the role of an innovation intermediary. And the government during this time created markets for technologies through public procurement and also standard setting and so forth. In the last stage, the Republic of Korea continued demand side approach with top level R&D inputs and outputs. But the main policy target actually shifted from large companies to SMEs because basically the Korean large conglomerates, they had enough resources and they didn't need to have helps from the public sector anymore. And so GRIs and universities, they basically fill the gap, focusing on basic research. And the government is still now constantly reviewing the efficiency of SDI policies. So in terms of governance, institutions, R&D investment, and contents. And now we move to China. So in China, they have a little bit different heritage in terms of STI system. So basically, between 1960s and 1970s, they basically had these technologies for atomic and hydrogen bombs and ICBM and satellite. So this means that China had a certain level of basic S&T system in the past, but due to the Cultural Revolution period, the system was quite disrupted. So the initial mission of China was to restore this S&T system at the time. And for STI system, China adopted supply side approach. They basically focused on commercialization of technologies by their GRIs, which actually failed in retrospect. At the same time, for foreign technologies, they basically was heavily dependent on trading markets for technology strategy, which also resulted in minimal success between the 1980s and 1990s. So with these lessons, since early 2000s, the Chinese government basically adopted a demand-side approach with the adoption of innovation system concept. And they basically committed strongly to indigenous R&D efforts with their GRIs and universities. But at the same time, they also continued the use of technology transfer through international joint venture arrangements. And in tandem with indigenous R&D efforts, this strategy finally became successful and sufficiently to absorb foreign technologies. Now China is positioned at technology creation stage, and they continued demand-side approach with a variety of market creating policies. And they are now competing in high-tech and new emerging industries based on their world-class S&T system. And there is also strong university GRIs industry collaboration for promoting new technologies in emerging industries, and especially for new digital technology sectors. They let private sectors actually lead these big national R&D programs. So this means that demand-side approach prevails in China now. Okay, now we have Thai case. So I already mentioned that they are in most time located at introduction stage, which is until 1996. And between these two, they are actually divided into two phases. The early one with import substitution strategy until 1980, and the second one with export orientation strategy until the economic crisis in 1997. So during the first phase, basically it was dominated by industrial trade and investment policies. Their strategy was basically sourcing foreign advanced technologies through FDI, and for the purpose of promoting import substituting industries inside Thailand. And there was very limited interest in SDI policies, one of which is the establishment of Ministry of Science and Technology and Environment in 79. Well, that was the only policy that we could find during this stage. Second phase is export-oriented strategy. Same, although they successfully transitioned from import substitution industrialization to export-oriented industrialization in the early 1980s, and this became very successful until the Asian economic crisis at 96. But still, my point here is that Thai was still dominated by industrial trade and investment policies, and also the way to source foreign technologies through FDI didn't change at all. And the change was only for the target industries. This time they were export industries from import substituting industries. And interest in SDI policies emerged, but it was mainly supply side approach. So they basically established several sector-specific GRIs, and also they invested money on academic research, but with the linear model of innovations. So there was no linkage basically between STI arena to industrial arena. So after the Asian economic crisis, Thai began to realize, their structural weaknesses and also the importance of STI as a tool to tackle their problems. So from that moment, Thai government actually stressed a demand-side approach at the policy design level, adopting the concept of national innovation systems. However, apart from some exceptions, for example, food industry, SDI policy at the implementation level remains very fragmented and inefficient. So on the bottom in the table, you can see several demand-side policies and supply-side policies, which some of them were efficient for a while, but it didn't provide sustainable industrialization for Thailand. So lessons from the past. So through the case studies on Republic of Korea, China, and Thai industrialization, we actually draw some lessons. The first one is STI indicators of R&D inputs and outputs that we have used were useful for understanding differentiating technology development stages. However, it should be borne in mind that policymakers should not assume that increasing R&D inputs will automatically upgrade a country's technological development. And second, throughout the period, SDI policies should be demand-driven. Demand-driven here means that SDI policies should be aligned with industrial policies because they are complementary to each other. And accordingly, the content of SDI policies will evolve over the course of a country's industrial development as each stage of a developing country manifests different needs of industrial sectors. And as shown in the Thai case, investment-led growth has its limits. So Thailand became very successful in reaching upper middle income status by foreign direct investments by the Asian economic crisis. However, it failed to sustain its industrial and economic growth without sufficient indigenous technology development. And also, as shown in the previous slide, utilization of foreign technologies does not diminish even in technology creation stage. So obviously, the relative importance of sourcing foreign technologies decreases over the course of industrial development. But China, Korea, both countries still utilize foreign technologies. Therefore, it remains as one of important mechanisms to learn new technologies. And also, in case of Korea and China, they had full support of high-level leadership. On the other hand, Thailand also had a policy coordinating body for SDI policies, but they didn't have enough support from the higher leadership. I guess that is one of the reasons why SDI policies are not implemented well in Thailand at the implementation level. And lastly, but not least, creating markets can facilitate industrial upgrading, especially in the later phase of industrialization. Because government interventions in creating markets through either public procurement or standard setting policies, as shown in the Korea and China, these interventions can facilitate actually to reduce technology and market uncertainties. So obviously, to develop a new technology, a developing country, have to invest lots of money with huge uncertainties, both in technology and market. But through these creating markets measures, they can actually reduce these uncertainties. So this is my last slide. So the main policy conclusion from our findings on 3 case studies is actually summarized by the below 3 key principles. So demand-driven approach, so aligning SDI policies to the needs of industrial policies are very important throughout the process of industrial development for a developing country. And also, strong commitments to indigenous innovation efforts are needed with the beginning of the technology internalization stage from the experiences of China and the Republic of Korea. And lastly, the government's capacity to reflect on and adapt to changing environments is very important because, I mean, in all 3 countries, there were, several shifts of policy stance. In case of Thailand, for example, from import substitution to export orientation. So in this case, the government's capacity to reply to these changing environments actually matters a lot for the success or failure of the industrialization of a country. So here, the main point with these three key principles is the heavy involvement of the government in a developing country. And especially when we consider the contemporary challenges like digital transformation, climate change, and inequality, I guess the involvement of the developing countries' government for promotion of their industrialization should be higher, even in addressing the twin challenges. Here I mean by twin challenges, traditional industrial growth, as well as addressing the contemporary challenges. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dong-Gun. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I think this idea of combining supply demand is something to stress. I'd like to now call Professor Mr. Sakhin Chaturvedi, Director General of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RICE, in India, to provide some comments on the report, but also to bring some, to extend this resonate with other experiences in developing countries, but also particularly with your country, with India. What can additional elements we can bring for this discussion? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks, Fernando, for getting the stage set. And I would very much like to thank Dr. Dong-Yun Park for giving us an overview of how he looks at the work that has come in and in what way this should be interpreted. And I would very much like to congratulate UNIDO for getting these case studies done and also giving me this opportunity, for which I'm very thankful. I think the report provides an updated review of sort of very relevant literature that has appeared across in last couple of years on how do we connect the STI policy with industrial policy, which is now a major challenge before several latecomers in the technology race. And the literature review in the first few parts of the three chapters, they have captured the essence of the East Asian experience, the process of industrialization, the technological capability building that is needed. But it has also sort of set the stage in terms of how industrialization processes through technological developments that happen through different stages are to be configured. And I think the report is extremely candid in terms of the limitations, the constraints, but also it confronts the sort of new changes that are coming in, particularly in terms of digital transformation, climate change. So it brings in the ideas that are related to the new technologies, the efforts that Korea, China, and Thailand have made in their own right in terms of bringing in the greenness in the process of industrialization, in the process of manufacturing, as was just now mentioned by Dr. Park, in terms of demand side approach. So trying to have instruments which are actually creating market conditions. So the report talks about the electric vehicles. It talks about the new incentive mechanisms for their wider adoption, and also connecting industrial policy with that. So technology transfer, not as one for all affair, but trying to bring in internal capacity building in terms of how we look at some of these questions. And that, I think, is one big advantage that we are seeing. And this is where I think, Fernando, the whole idea of a new approach in India in terms of bringing in climate resilient infrastructure, climate resilient technology adoption policy, I think they assume great importance in terms of identifying the possibilities that are there for partnerships and also for India to push in. And we find that giving the dividends in terms of how we see consistent rise in share of manufacturing value added in India's GDP, and that I think is getting reflected through a major increase in Indian nationals getting patents in environment safer technologies. So that application, which was in 2003, only 33,000 patents were applied, and you find that at the end of 2022, the number has already jumped to 48,000 such patents. So you find a bandwidth which is coming in, but the same bandwidth, if you apply in terms of financing of technologies, then you see the new effort is trying to connect a huge gap that we hitherto saw in India's industrial policy and connect with the process of economic growth. You find a lot of exclusions that had happened. So with commitment on SDGs, you find science, technology, innovation policies which are trying to create more of digitalization. And fortunately, the COVID-19 crisis has been leveraged to a great extent, not only in terms of manufacturing, producing vaccines, the PPE kits, which India now has emerged as a major exporter of several items that are needed in the pharmaceuticals and biopharmaceutical landscape. The whole vaccine success story is a very clear example of how R&D system, government incentive mechanisms, industrial policy, how they all are connected with each other. And how do you ensure such delivery when such time-bound challenges are there before humanity? It was not confined to India. Within a few months, we could supply to most of the northern countries, most of the European countries, including the United States, and then supplying to Africa. By an estimate, almost 34% of the total vaccine consumption in Africa is supplied by India. So you find the COVID-19 as a major change in terms of how we are going to do that. And Fernando, I think when we talk about the public sector capability building in countries like India, where development challenges are immense, skilled manpower is a huge, huge limitation. And I think in industrial policy, you have to focus on human resources that can really produce. And India has now launched a major platform called GITA, which brings in Global Innovation and Technology Alliance, where India is incentivizing its own people, the expatriates who are based in other countries, to come back to India. And with the new opportunities that are coming in, more and more are coming back. So these dimensions are there. India's huge infrastructure deficit. This year, India announced a mega $26 billion project for building up India's infrastructure deficit. And believe me, Fernando, a major part of this is going in terms of how you leverage information technology for manufacturing in the areas that are important for infrastructure building. Hitherto, India was dependent on imports from a couple of countries. With disruption of supply chains, India has augmented India's own capacity for production. And that, I think, has given a major push for indigenization of production, connecting with new technologies and expanding the schemes. There is a new scheme that India has launched. It's called as Production Linked Incentive Scheme. Production Linked Incentive Scheme. It's called PLI scheme. And under PLI scheme, again, India has given $26 billion. So these two mega schemes, one, the infrastructure development, which has been given $26 billion, and another $26 billion has been given for this PLI scheme. So these two flagship schemes of this government in India have pushed in both the indigenous capacity building and also infrastructure building. And apart from GITA, a couple of other schemes, I'm not getting into them, but they have also augmented the capability of the public sector enterprises, because digitalization is important. And since I am also on the board of the Central Bank of India, Board of Governors of the Reserve Bank of India, I can tell you, Fernando, the effort that has gone in terms of digitalization of the payment architecture. so the POS machines, etc., to small vendors across the country, the micro and small and medium enterprises whose business was affected because of COVID and lockdowns. Efforts have been made to bring them under the digitalization process. And the point that Dr. Dongon Park mentioned in case of Thailand, of connecting them all through with new policy trust, I think that is what is going to offer new job opportunities. Our estimation at my research institute is that more than 600,000 jobs have been created in last 2.5 years. When major countries are facing challenges, India is creating these opportunities. And India is creating major job opportunities. And no surprise that you see a major traction in India's GDP growth. So manufacturing now, which was dominated by services sector economy and less so by agriculture, now you find manufacturing coming in. And manufacturing, which is serving the day-to-day requirements of the country and also trying to see where we can reduce dependence. And digital payment architecture, the UPI, is a major example. The fourth point that I want to make where more public capacity building is required is in terms of agriculture technology. And this agri-tech, where manufacturing and agriculture are converging, which is South Korea's success, but is also a success we find in Israel, where climate resilient infrastructure for agriculture, value added, is something which Israel has done marvelously well, of using machines for water conservation and drip irrigation. And this we were not manufacturing. The soil testing machines, the sowing machines, which South Korea has developed, are very ICT incentive. So agro machinery system, which we never paid attention, I think is now assuming greater importance in terms of how we are going to go forward. And this, I think, is part of the 9 technology mission initiative that Prime Minister launched some time back, where artificial intelligence, quantum technology, semiconductor, smart manufacturing, blockchains, and deep ocean, they are connected, which are going to give support to the blue economy, but also at the same time trying to see how the agriculture machinery and equipment, which are also important for fisheries and blue economy, how they can be linked. So I find this report extremely interesting, and I'm sure it would be a sort of roadmap for many other countries to follow the excellent connect that UNIDO has suggested in terms of establishing between the economic development, industrial policy, and its connect with science, technology, and innovation. Fernando, there is a project I am leading in India, which is about STI for SDG, with Japanese G20 presidency launched. And incidentally, the first meeting of Japanese presidency on STI for SDG was held in Seoul. So Japan and South Korea partnered for Japanese G20 presidency, and I had the opportunity of being in Seoul for this discussion on STI for SDG. Now it's a major international project in which EU is working. 5 African countries are involved. India is there and Japan is there. So I think it's a major study that STAPI and UNIDO have done in partnership with South Korean government. I congratulate both the institutions, and I am sure this study would be a landmark for many others to follow in this area. Thanks, Fernando, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hatube. Thank you very much for the interesting points. Particularly, I think it resonates strongly with some of the last points from Dong-un in terms of the next frontier is not only the technologies for competitiveness, but also thinking on the sustainable development goals and the challenges, how to transform some of the development challenges into industrialization opportunities. We see those very clearly from the pandemic, but you are also mentioning other areas, and so let's not forget that some of the structural challenges remain there, and the idea here is that science, technology, innovation, coupled with industrial policies, can help in that sense. And maybe just a question. Instead of just giving the floor to that, maybe before I know you had to go, but there's a question in the chat, Dr. Shalvedi. Maybe if you can take 1-2 minutes to comment, this coordination and at the government level, right? So when you talk about science, technology, and industrial policy, sometimes this can be dissociated in terms of the government structure. But maybe a couple of minutes, how is this coordination happening in India, for example?
As I mentioned, there is a new approach now in India where quite a few of new outfits are coming in. So special purpose vehicles are being created for instance, the 9 technology mission that I mentioned. The government has created special purpose vehicles. So we are coming over the systemic inertia of public sector enterprises and the bureaucratic hurdles that we created for ourselves by bringing in these dimensions of work. So what we are trying to create is to bring in more flexibility, bring in more dynamism in the public sector enterprises. So they need to understand, so more and more of revolving door policy for private entrepreneurs to become part of the government and government to become part of the private entrepreneur setting ups that are there. And this is creating a major opportunity for many areas. And even funding architecture is changing. So more of the clusters are coming in instead of institutions working independently in isolation. More and more effort is on to bring institutions together. So these two approaches, I think, are going to give the new dividends that are needed.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for the additional. Maybe Dong-un, a last minute comment before we move to the next session. And I think some of these issues now about the government capacities, I think we are already sliding in that direction. So I think it's just maybe focusing particularly in the chat, there is a question on knowledge management and collaborative work. Maybe 1 or 2 minutes that, from the experience in the report, can you comment something quickly? Thank you.
I just want to add just one thing for my presentation about the report. So basically, I forgot to actually point out the importance of local company. So the existence of local company. Obviously, in the STI arena, there are many actors that produce scientific knowledge and technology and so forth. But in the end, these technical knowledge and innovations can be commercialized only through the existence of local company. So in case of Thailand, there was no meaningful existence of local companies' desire to innovate themselves for commercialization. So I just want to point out just one thing, and also about the Professor Chaturvedi's comment. It was very insightful because, as Fernando mentioned, that because we adopted this historical perspective, and the Republic of Korea, China, they all industrialized quite early in the past with kind of traditional mechanism. And in the era of this targeting sustainable development goals with this current issue of COVID-19 and digital transformation, I guess the professor gave us very good examples through the experience of India. So thank you very much for sharing those examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, both Professor Chaturvedi and Dong-un, for setting the scene and starting the conversation. And I think we are already, as I said, moving into the next part of the panel. Thank you again. Thank you also for those who, please feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat. We will be taking some of them as we move on. Let's start now focusing on the issue of government capabilities. And I'd like to invite Professor Sung-Soo Chung, is the CEO of the Wonjung Institute in South Korea and former president of STEPI. Since we started talking about industrial policy, but also the idea that behind industrial policy and STI policy, there is a government that implements the science and follows up. So maybe for the next part, can you maybe share with us some insights from the Korean experience and looking into sort of historical perspective, but also some current challenges. Please, Dr. Chung, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do today is to give you a little bit of discussion on what Korea has done in order to science technology policy capacity in the course of the economic development. The issue of science and technology first emerged in Korea in the process of the formulation of the first five-year economic development plan, which lasted from 1960 to 1966. In January 1962, the draft of the plan was briefed to the political leadership. And at the place, after hearing the draft, the political leaders raised several important questions, such as, do we really have the technologies and skills required for the industrialization? How can we acquire the technologies required for the industrialization? How can we meet the skill requirement? Who are responsible for all of this? And given the technical constraints, would it be possible for Korea to realize the ambitious goals set by the plans? All these questions were pointing to the fact that the plan lacked critical strategic element. By that I mean how to acquire and mobilize scientific and technological resources required for industrial development or scientific and technological strategy. In response to the questions, the Economic Planning Board, which was responsible for the planning, prepared in 1962 another plan, which is technical backup plan as a supplement to the economic development plan. Since then, science and technology have been placed in the core of Korea's development policy. In the early stage of development, science and technology policy was very much tuned to building science and technology capacity for industrialization. As no sector in Korea was technologically prepared for industrialization, the government had to intervene in almost every sector for science and technology capacity building, which required solid scientific policy capacity. As you know, a policy process begins with understanding the issues. You should know what's going on, what's happening in your country in order to translate the issues into policies. So we need to understand the nature of the policy issues. In order to understand the issues, we need data, information, statistics, indicators, and other information. In order to collect all of them, we need information system. In addition to that, information system is not sufficient to understand the whole nature of the issues. You need to know how to analyze the problems by using those information and statistics, data, so on and so forth. So we need kind of system to conduct policy research. If you identify the issues, oops, sorry. Can we go back? Okay. So based on the understanding, we should be able to formulate policy measures to deal with the issues which we identified. In order to do that, we need to have organizational apparatus to formulate policy measures. And in addition to that, of course, we need technical competence of bureaucrats who are working within the apparatus. Finally, the policy measures should be put into action. And in order to do that, we need resources to implement the policy measures. We need money, we need organizational resources, we need people. And more importantly, we need political leadership, which can ensure long-term policy commitment to the science and technology. So it really depends upon the political competence of science and technology leadership. From this, we can define what policy capacity means. Policy capacity is determined by a set of skills and resources that are required to perform policy functions, such as analytical competence, operational competence, and political competence. Each of these activities, competencies, involves resources and/or capabilities at individual, organizational, and systemic levels. Therefore, policy capacity can be defined as an integration of capability to systematically diagnose policy problems, capability to formulate sets of measures to respond to the problems, and capability to put the policy measures into action in a consistent and effective manner. Now, I'd like to touch upon the Korean experience in building science and technology policy capacity. Korea started the efforts with building a science and technology information system. The Technology Management Bureau of the Economic Planning Board, I mentioned that was the government ministry which was responsible for planning. The TMB deserves a high credit for laying a foundation for science and technology statistical system in Korea by initiating the following efforts. It first conducted the survey of nation's technical manpower in 1961. That was very, very radical movement in the perspective of 1961. That was done in order to back up the formulation of the first 5-year technology promotion plan, which was a supplement to the economic development plan. It also launched the Science Technology White Paper, an annual report presenting the state of science and technology of the nation. And most importantly, they launched in 1963, the annual survey of R&D activities based on the UNESCO manual. And the survey covered all organizations engaged in R&D in Korea, including government agencies, public R&D institutes, universities, private R&D centers, and many others. In 1967, the Ministry of Science and Technology was created by expanding the Technology Management Bureau of the EPB, and it took over the science and technology related functions and responsibilities from the EPB. The Ministry of Science and Technology further improved and broadened the information system. They initiated the Technology Foresight Program in 1993. The ministry revamped the R&D survey system in order to accommodate the OECD standard for SCADI manual in 1996. The ministry launched the Innovation Survey based on the Oslo manual of the OECD in 1996 and launched a biennial survey of public understanding of science in 2000 and launched an annual statistics of technology trade in 2001. So the statistical system has been very much expanded and improved. And all of this system has been integrated into the National Science and Technology Information Service in 2005 by the government. And it is a national science technology portal that provides information on everything related to science and technology. For example, science and technology policy, R&D programs, human resources, R&D outputs, and so on and so forth, including, and in addition to that, R&D institutions, funding agencies, rules and regulations regarding national R&D programs, and so on and so forth. So that's the way they built the information system as a part of our science technology policy capacity. Yeah, this is a list of the statistics and information being conducted by the government. Okay, let's move. Now, analytical capacity. Well, as I said, information is not enough. It's not sufficient. You should know how to analyze. You should be able to analyze what is the nature of the problem on the basis of the information. So in the beginning, Korea tried to learn the attained analytical capacity, partly by working with international and domestic consultants. And we relied heavily on technical assistance programs of ODA providers in the 60s and in some part of the 1970s too. And also they sent many government officials to foreign countries for policy training. That was the way they tried to, build up policy planning capacity of the bureaucrats in Korea. And then in 1970s, as an organizational apparatus of policy planning, they created Ministry of Science and Technology, as I mentioned, by expanding the Technology Management Bureau of the Economic Planning Board, which already had policy planning experiences. TMB brought not only policy planning experience to most, but also development-oriented culture to most, which is very, very important. So the EPB background of the most benefited most in several ways. First, transfer of policy experiences and planning capacity. Second, integrating science technology policy with national development goals. Third, easier access to resources, because budget was in the purview of the Economic Planning Board. They had an easier access to resources than other ministries. And most importantly, having experienced policy planning in EPB, most people had a broader perspectives on science and technology than the lay people. Next. Third, the government people try to learn how to analyze the problems by working with government R&D institutes. Government officials acquired policymaking capacity by working with scientists and engineers of government R&D institutes who had industrial experiences in advanced countries. For example, scientists and engineers at KIST collaborated with government officials in designing policy plans for the development of strategic industries such as steel, electronics, machineries, automobiles, chemicals, and so on and so forth. And by interacting with the scientists and engineers, government officials learned to understand technical issues involved in the industrial development and develop new perspectives on the role of science and technology in economic development. Finally, what was important for the policy planning capacity of the Korean government was the personal abilities of government officials. Young elites in the 1960s, and even today it is true, preferred government careers for diverse reasons: prestige, political opportunity, job stability, cultural traditions that places a higher value on government positions, and so on so forth. So government could attract very many good people. That's very one of the important reasons that they could build strong policy capacity in the government. As a matter of fact, the contribution of elite bureaucrats to the Korean development can never be overestimated. Next. Next is political capacity or political commitment to the policy. Korea has been able to implement the science technology policy program in a consistent manner, owing very much to the future-oriented resource allocation of the government. Today, the Korean government allocate more than 4.6% of its budget to science and technology, or it accounts for about 1.2% of GDP, or it is almost 30%, 25% of the total gross expenditures on R&D in Korea. In addition to that, the government allocates 14% of its budget for education, which is about 3.7 or 4% of the GDP. Investment in science and technology has contributed enormously to economic growth, which in turn has made further increases in R&D investment possible. Second factor is a strong support of the political leaders. The science technology-based development strategy was first initiated by the late President Park, who served during the period 61 to 78. The strategy played a critical role in industrializing Korea in a very short period of time. The strategy has been maintained over the past 50 years, regardless of the political orientation of the succeeding governments, mainly because of the strong consensus among the Korean people on the role of science and technology in the national development. Next, please. So the science and technology policy has been very closely linked to the national development. During the early stage, during the period of 60s and 80s, the national development goal was industrialization based on low and mid technology industries. And in order to support that, the science technology policy promoted technological learning. And during the 80s and 2000, the second stage, the development goal was how to, making structural transformation into heavy technology industries. And in order to support that, in order to facilitate that, the science and technology policy promoted R&D for technological catch-up. And now they are seeking the realization of innovation-based creative economy. So government science and technology policy is tuned to nurturing creativity, promotion of new technology-based startup, and so on and so forth. So science and technology policy has been very closely linked to national development. Next, please. So based on such policy capacity, Korea has been able to achieve tremendous economic development. And the strategy can be summed as government-led economic development based on science and technology. Korea was one of the poorest economy in the world in the 60s. And today, Korea emerged as one of the major players in R&D in the world and achieved very rapid growth based on R&D. Indeed, Korea achieved very R&D intensive economic growth over the past decades. But there are many issues too. The main issue is that because of the success, people seem to believe that even unnecessary intervention of the government in innovation policies, it seems that even unnecessary intervention of the government in the innovation process is still justified or accepted in the Korean society. It is, I think, the major issue in the Korean innovation system today. Can I move? Well, let me mention a little bit about the lessons we can derive from the Korean experience. The Korean experiences show that science technology policy capacity is the key to building a foundation for science and technology development, particularly in the early stage of development when private sectors are not technologically prepared for industrial development. As a Korea did, I think developing countries can take advantage of ODA in order to upgrade policy capacity, as Korea did in training government officials. Korea took a very positive attitude toward ODA in the sense that we try to maximize the opportunity ODA programs offered in learning technologies and learning policy programs. Second, I think science and technology information system is indispensable in building policy capacity without exception. And I think policy think tank plays a very important role in building analytical capacity of the government. So I would recommend strongly in late coming countries to start with building science technology information system in a very systematic manner, and try to establish, launch policy research organizations in order to work with the bureaucrats and for policy planning. Lastly, I think political leadership is critical in making policies work. Without their support, nothing can work. So having a leadership, having a political patronage is very critical in making policies work. But I think, even though I said many good things about Korea, I think it is very, very important to note that government intervention may be highly effective in the early stage of development, but to sustain the effectiveness of the policy, the role of government has to be adjusted to the changing policy environment, because changes in environment needs different roles of the government. And that's something we have to do in Korea. I think that's what I have to say, and hope have comments from you and have a further discussion on the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi. Very, very comprehensive, and I really appreciate, you went from the individual capacities to organizational and institutional capacities, which is something that certainly we need to discuss, the heterogeneity of the capacities involved in these processes. But without more comments, I would like to invite now Professor Rainer Cattell he's a professor of innovation and public policy at the University College of London, to provide us some comments and additional remarks on this idea of Korea, but also some additional insights from other work that you might have done around this idea of government capacities. Professor Cattell, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for this invitation, and thanks for these really excellent two presentations, I think, this morning, well, at least this morning in London. I really enjoyed both the overall presentation of case studies of Korea, China, and Thailand, and also the capacity-related case study. I think there are really interesting lessons from both studies, I think. And first of all, I think it's really important to understand that public sector capacity is a moving target. As technology, innovation evolve, so do public sector capacities. We just heard also very interestingly in the case of Korea, how this is changing and how this has to change. You have to adapt as policymakers in terms of capacities that you're building. So I think, and also I find it really interesting, these different stages of development, technology creator, technology adopter, and whatnot in cases of Korea and China and Thailand. I think it's clear that you need different kinds of public sector capacities as well. So you have to continuously build and evolve public sector capacities as well, I think, which is like the first lesson from these, for me at least. The second one, I think, is what is really interesting in all of those cases is the public sector capacity. It's very much in the case of development, it is about shaping, creating markets, working with the markets rather than being sort of in the secondary positions. The governments really have to be, co-creators of markets, which I think is very, very important. Almost like a mental position to take for public organizations and public policymakers, so that they are not just leaving the sort of the private actors to be in charge of the market and then the key market actors, but actually the public sector itself is a key shaper and co-creator of markets, which seems to be a very strong lesson from these case studies as well. So you have to build capacities for that. You have to build capacities for market creation and market shaping. So I think and how to do that, I think there are two really important issues from sort of my own work here, but also with the lessons from these case studies that we heard this morning. So first of all, you have to build what I would call long-term capacities. How do you make civil service, for instance, attractive? How do you build civil services systems so that over decades you get talented people joining public sector? So as we just heard in the case of Korea from Chungchul, I think it was very interesting how this, from the 60s onwards, so it's like 60 years by now, you build a strong civil service system. So this is an investment into civil service. And how do you do that? But also like institutions, building institutions and continuously innovating in those institutions, not being satisfied that you have an SDI policy council or you have an institutions that invest in SDI policies, but you continuously build them and think about them and build their capabilities internally as well. But also around investment, so you actually need to invest. And I think what we heard today, what is really interesting is in these long-term capacities, political leadership is very important. The political leaders are buying into that message, that they are actually, because this requires long-term commitment. So you have to take a long-term view. And so for that, you need political leaders who are committed, who are not just sort of giving up after 1 or 2 years. And that requires, as I said, political leadership. So for these long-term capacities. And then on the other hand, I think you really need also what I call dynamic capabilities in public organizations for adapting to continuously changing environment in technology, in business, but also as we see these days, security environments can change very quickly for countries. So you have to be able to adapt and take advantage. And I think we heard today that what is really important in that sort of dynamic capabilities of public organizations are, what I would call sense-making capabilities, both like engineering capabilities, technical capabilities, but also how do you analyze, markets, marketplaces? Do you focus on market failures or you actually think of more systematically innovation systems, have a complex view of analyzing things? So as we just heard from Chungchul, I think the analytical capabilities are incredibly important, but you need to constantly hone them, upgrade them, update them. So this is how you do that. You work together with various universities and organizations, but I think this is really, to me, it seems like really key. And the second key dynamic capability, what I also heard today, is this ability to connect with various organizations, private sector organizations, to network, to work with them, but also to understand when we need to move away from large companies to SMEs, for instance. How do we use foreign technology? How do we build indigenous companies? How do we help indigenous companies? And so I think that's another really key aspect for public organizations, is how do we actually deal with stakeholders? How do we network? How do we connect with various stakeholders? How do we make this networking actually real rather than tokenistic? And what I think the third dynamic capability for public organizations seems to be is the ability to implement and to operationalize, to actually create procurement rules, that are useful for domestic companies in order for them to upgrade, for instance, or to create regulations that are helpful, or to look at even regulations around trade and finance, and so it's really about operationalizing all of those sort of analytical skills or the intelligence that you learn. So how do you operationalize that? It's very much about these kind of implementation skills. So I think and these dynamic capabilities are really situated on the level of organization. So how do you build organizations that are able to continuously learn and adopt? So long-term capacity is very important. Political leadership, but I think in terms of dynamic capabilities, it's very much around building organizations that are able to learn and adapt quickly. And I think this in both of these presentations today, we heard like excellent lessons, I think, and I really enjoyed both presentations. I think they provide a really key lessons for developing countries really across the world, and I think it's a very very fascinating. So this is sort of for me very quickly quick reactions to the presentations, and thank you very much for both presentations.
Thank you, Professor Capel. Thank you, and particularly this, this idea of dynamic capability, which implies, again, reiterates the effort. I mean, it's a long-term effort, just as we feel of industrialization as a cumulative process, right, and a process that builds on itself, yeah, in a sort of long-term commitment, and also the political will, and also resonates with the idea of changing the directions as development goes. You have to change direction and target. So thank you very much for that. But also I would like now to move on also to bring some the practitioner's perspective and the policymaker perspective, and for that, of course, I'm happy to invite to introduce Madame Fatma Abdul Rahman Ahmed, who is the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Industrial Development, SMEs, and Cooperatives of Mauritius. Mr. Ahmed brings the perspective, as I said, the policymaker and a developing country, right? So I would like to invite Mr. Ahmed to take the floor, please.
Good afternoon. How are you all?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Looking forward to your comments and your experiences. So we've been involved in some of particularly important policy processes in your country, and we would like to hear from you the experiences in terms of what it means for the government capacities and what it means in terms of all the issues that we are discussing around institutions, skills, and the law. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fernando Santiago Rodriguez, Ms. Lydia Zagato, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Warm greetings from Mauritius. Good afternoon here. So it is my immense pleasure to be with you virtually for this important UNIDO STI event and share my thoughts, insights on science, technology, and innovation in the context of the Mauritian manufacturing sector. At the outset, allow me to express my gratitude to UNIDO, and especially to Anders Isaacson for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event. My thanks also to Mr. Fernando and Ms. Lydia for the efficient coordination in the successful organization of this panel discussion. All right, today's topic is of extreme relevance to the Mauritian case. In 2019, Mauritius graduated to the level of high-income economy, but later on, following the negative impact of COVID-19 pandemic, it was rated again as an upper middle income country. So, insights derived from today's event will enable us to redynamize the economic landscape of the country. It is also an excellent opportunity and platform for Mauritius to share its ideas on STI and industrial development and formulate policies for STI inspired from our industrial policy and strategic plan 2020-2025, which was launched in December 2020. STI has played an important role in the industrialization process of Mauritius. Before proceeding any further, I would like to give a snapshot of Mauritius. Mauritius, as I mentioned, is an upper middle income country lying on the southeast of the African continent in the Indian Ocean, with a multicultural population of 1.3 million inhabitants. The Mauritian economy revolves around 5 important sectors, namely agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, ICT, and more recently, financial services. Mauritius is often used as a reference because it was a good ranking in various aspects of doing business. For example, it is ranked first in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business in Sub-Saharan Africa and 13th ranking in the world. As regards the manufacturing sector, it has become a major pillar of the economy and has successfully transmuted from being a producer of basic apparel products to high value added and sophisticated products, including branded apparel products, sophisticated jewelry, watch movements, aircraft components, and medical devices. I would like to illustrate how technology has transformed our manufacturing sector over the years by taking the example of the textile and clothing industry. In the 1970s, our textile and clothing sector witnessed a timid start, but later on, with the arrival of Hong Kong-based investors, the technology of garment making relating to stitching, pressing, and finishing processes was introduced in the country. Gradually, the technology intake of the sector was scaled up with the introduction of new machines and equipment for cotton, knitting, dyeing, spinning, and weaving. These new technologies have allowed the textile and clothing sector to embrace vertical integration and ensure value-added components in our textile products, rendering them more competitive on the global market. At present, Mauritius can boast of having some of the largest spinning and weaving plants in sub-Saharan Africa and of producing garments for the majority of international brands. It is worth mentioning that technology has also prompted a significant transformation in the other subsectors of manufacturing, namely food and fish preparation, jewelry, medical devices, and light engineering. From the policy-making standpoint, I wish to elaborate on how the ministry has incorporated the overarching element of STI in its strategies for industrial development. The ministry launched its Industrial Policy and Strategy Plan, IPSP 2020 to 2025 in December 2020, which was prepared in collaboration with UNCTAD. The vision of the industrial sector, as spelled out in the IPSP document, is to achieve a globally competitive and sustainable industrial sector that contributes to higher economic growth for Mauritius through continuous innovation, technology upgrading, productivity gains, and high-scale employment. The framework proposed in the IPSP is anchored on 5 main strategic thrusts: strengthening of our industrial foundations, upgrading of value chains, supporting local production, promoting regional and global exports, and fostering the adoption of smart and advanced technologies related to Industry 4.0. It is viewed that these strategic thrusts will have a considerable transformative effect on the manufacturing sector. So, the strengthening of industrial foundations will impact on important aspects such as skills and labor market, soft infrastructure such as standards and IT, and hard infrastructure which consists of building, land, and so on. In Mauritius presently, the availability of a skilled pool of labor is considered as the cornerstone for the growth of the economy. In this line, the IPSP considers a major overhauling in the different scales of development program to include STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at all levels to guarantee the required transformation. The IPSP has made a clarion call to consider seriously STEM and the academic triangle to support the manufacturing sector. The other aspects for this strategic thrust, namely developing standards for international markets and ensuring a proper digital infrastructure, was equally dependent on science, technology, and innovation. It is also observed that the upgrading of our value chains cannot be realized without STI. This strategy advocates the upgrading and diversification of our products and production processes through innovation and the adoption of latest technologies. It is to be pointed out that the IPSP has recommended the setting up of a technology innovation incentive to support major potential technological advancement within the Mauritian manufacturing ecosystem. This will allow manufacturers to undertake high-value research and development activities, including the adoption of a range of emerging technologies associated with Internet of Things and artificial intelligence. Now, the strategic thrust relating to fostering the adoption of smart and advanced technologies related to Industry 4.0 is more important, as these are the drivers that will bring manufacturing to new growth levels. As a matter of fact, government is providing the necessary financial support to manufacturing enterprises to embrace latest technologies with the recently set up Modernization and Transformation Fund. So, Mr. Fernando, I have highlighted the importance of STI in the manufacturing landscape of Mauritius, especially with reference to the IPSP. I have also mentioned how innovation and technology upgrading will bring about the transformation in our manufacturing sector for greater competitiveness. So thank you very much. Don't hear you. You have to unmute.
Yes, I had to unmute. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much for very insightful comments and this roller coaster dynamics of becoming a high income country and facing the circumstances that we faced and then going some steps back and as we said earlier the dynamic process of development and commitment and adjusting us along the way, right? So thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists. I think this has been so far the first block of questions. I also see some questions already. So if you don't mind, I will pass some of the questions for the panelists. I think here, let me start with Dr. Chung. There's a question for you in terms of could you advise how developing countries can start building the mentioned capacities, right? So analytical capacity, policy planning capacity, and policy making. So what is the starting point and how they go about it? Please unmute yourself. Dr. Chung, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. The first thing you can do in order to build up policy capacity and developing countries, I think, is to take advantage of the technical assistance programs of the ODA providers. Actually, Korea has been very active in utilizing the ODA programs in order to build policy capacity in the early stage of development during the 50s and 60s. Many Korean government officials, young people, were sent to the United States for policy study. They learned new things. Korea was nowhere in terms of everything back in 1950s. And then the young people came back and started to build up the whole infrastructure, policy infrastructure. So perhaps if you get actively engaged in learning from ODA programs, you can really get something out of that. In order to that, I think the developing countries have to have some kind of sense of ownership in ODA programs. They have to get involved very actively with the sense of ownership of the program. In the case of Korea, for example, when they had a training program, many people, of course, participated in the program. And after the termination of the ODA program, the program was further improved and expanded by the government. So we continued on the program even after the termination of the ODA program. That means Korea had a very strong sense of ownership in the program. So when you, in the beginning of the program, you have to be very actively engaged. You have to show what your needs are, what your demands are, and you have to make the programs oriented toward your own demands. Don't just follow the suggestions of the ODA providers. So that was what we did back in the 50s and 60s, and that was very effective in nurturing good people. I mean, well-functioning bureaucrats in Korea. Secondly, we, in order to catch up the long backlogs, we created policy research institutions. We brought in people from foreign countries who are already trained, and then they put them in a Korean context, and they had them work with the Korean government, and the government people, the bureaucrats, learned a lot by working with those people, the scientists and engineers, plus policy researchers. And through that processes, they learned how to analyze, how to read the statistics. They learned how to interpret numbers, what they mean, what are the meaning underlining the numbers and all the informations. That's the way they learned how to analyze the information they have in front of them. So that's the beginning of the building policy capacity in Korea. So there's no magic. I think we have to start from the beginning. We have to start from learning from others, and then strengthen your own capacity. And then what is important is you have to know how to localize what you learn from foreign countries. You have to translate what you learn into something in your own context. In other words, you have to know how to contextualize what you learn from the foreign professionals, foreign consultants, and so on and so forth. So that's the way we try to learn in the beginning, in the very beginning of the development, try to learn how to build our own policy capacity in Korea. So once again, we learned from the foreign countries. We sent many young people to foreign countries for advanced studies in the field of policy making. And also we try to bring in many people so that they can work with the government for economic development. That's the way we started building policy capacity in Korea.
Thank you, Dr. Shun. Thank you very much for this. Permanent Secretary Ahmed, can I now turn to you and ask, I mean, you described already some of the challenges in terms of the infrastructure and skills, right? But is there any, can you share maybe one sort of the most pressing challenges that you and your team face in terms of, you have this responsibility around innovation and growth of local firms. But can you maybe just one key aspect of challenges your team and how to support these companies? Please unmute yourself, sorry. Thank you.
Following the launching of the IPSP, our strategy plan, a committee under my chair was set up to oversee the implementation of the recommendations made in that strategy. Having a well-written document is not a winning recipe for the implementation of industrial policies. The main policy-making challenges that we are having to confront pertain for us to funding and coordination. During the past few months, we have witnessed the availability of funding is important to spur project realization. This was particularly compounded with the COVID-19 pandemic. It was difficult for firms to mobilize funds to upgrade their production lines. Despite the fact that investing in new technologies is costly, it is the only pathway for our enterprises to be equipped to cope with unprecedented challenges, such as COVID or whatever is in reserve for us, and to remain competitive. So the second challenge for us is coordination. We have seen that there are many stakeholders involved in implementing our industrial policy. These are enterprises, private sector apex bodies, support institutions, trade promotion organizations, government institutions, and the like. So industrial development will not be achieved if no synergy exists among these stakeholders. And for us, during the pandemic, our Honorable Minister, Sumil Dadbarat, has been having continuous and regular meetings with our stakeholders so that we are aware of what are their needs and how we can attend to them. And then government has come up with several support measures to help out. That was during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ahmed. Thank you very much for these insightful comments. And well, now, Professor Cattell, maybe now, can you? There's a question here, and you were talking about the capabilities, but there's a question here in terms of, what are the key areas for public sector to enhance capacity to innovate at the policy and framework levels? This design thinking, collaborative work, knowledge management. What sort of challenges you'd see? What are the, how to enhance the capacity of innovation policy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question in terms of the, what are the frameworks to use? And I think, as I said briefly in my comments, a lot of the governments are relying on sort of market failure and very economics-driven frameworks to analyze policies, for instance, or to analyze markets, and that's very often leads to actually quite restrictive government view on what they can do and what they have to do. So I think that's really the first step is to understand that market failure is a very helpful tool to analyze certain things, but it might not be a very helpful tool to guide policy action. So I think you need to have other layers of analytical frameworks, systems thinking, for instance, complexity economics, and trying to understand interaction agents rather than sort of single synthetic agents, if you will. So I think that's design thinking is excellent in terms of trying to engage wider citizenry into your policy making, for instance. And so I would recommend sort of to try to triangulate your policy evidence and policy methodologies, to use multiple perspectives to do that. And I think, of course, this requires resources and this requires time and competences. But to build that slowly, I think is really important, because then you actually are able to learn more and are able to question your own assumptions as policymakers, which is always the most difficult bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. I know we're just running out of time, but a couple of questions. I think maybe it's an obliged question for Dr. Shum, right? How easy is to replicate the Korean model in the sort of the modern circumstances? How replicable is the model now that it's a different world, right? Maybe in a couple of minutes, can you give us some comments, Dr. Shum? Oh, I cannot hear you. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry, I haven't been able to follow you.
Just the question on how replicable? How can we replicate the case of Korea in the sort of the current world?
Oh, that's huge problem. Well, there's nothing that can be applied to everywhere. There's nothing like that. So any experience you learn has to be contextualized. So, I mean, there has to be translated into the way that can be feasible in your own environment. So that's part of the capacity. It's a very important part of the policy capacity. You have to know how to translate what you learn into, I mean, into something that is feasible in your own environment. So in order to do that, you have to know what exactly is your demand, what exactly you want. So that's the first thing you have to understand. Sometimes many countries do not, I mean, they are not simply able to present what they want. They do not know what the demand real demand is. And that is not easy, because that has to be, I mean, something based on exact understanding of the environment, systems, and constraints of their own country. So the first thing is you have to know, I'm sorry, wait a minute. Oh, I'm sorry, it's getting dark here.
Yeah, no worries.
The first thing you have to know is what you really want, and then you have to know how to translate what you learn into something that can fit your need. That's not easy, but it's exactly what you should do, because you cannot import directly something from others. It's, in particular, I mean, policy cannot be really imported. It cannot be directly transplanted. It has to be modified, adjusted. It has to be, translated into something that can fit something that can meet your demand. In order to do that, once again, you have to know what you really want. Without knowing what you want, you can't really, adopt others' policy measures to apply to your own country. So that's something. It's very easy to say, but it's not really easy to implement. It's very difficult. It really requires in-depth study and in-depth communication within your community.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we are running a bit of short of time, but Mrs. Ahmed, would you like to have some 1 minute last famous words before we close the webinar? Well, I think she's maybe she's, Mr. Ahmed, Mrs. Ahmed, are still there?
Yes, give you the one.
Okay.
Yes.
If it's okay, if we are, if you have 1 minute just to say a final word, otherwise it's fine. We can just close now. And
Okay.
thank you. I think we basically. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me just now then give you the floor.
I just like to thank you, Nido Fernando, for giving me the opportunity to share my insight on STI on the manufacturing sector in Mauritius. So thank you again. I'm really sorry I have got another meeting scheduled, and it has been a pleasure to hear from you all and to meet you online. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam.
Bye to you all.
And with this note, I think I would just like to sort of wrap up with the idea that we started with a conversation around reviewing the cases of 3 dynamic countries that have industrialized based on the mix of policies that are targeting science, technology, innovation, also industrial policies in a dynamic way. And we have learned about the importance of the public sector infrastructure around those policies to make sure that there is direction, there is strategy, there is commitment, there is continuous efforts to improve the human base behind those policies, but also the complexity of building infrastructure, building research capacities, and mobilizing efforts of different agents. I think this is an important lesson, and as we move along in the activities of the project and other activities, this is something that we will remember. So I really would like to thank you on behalf of STEPI and UNIDO, if I may, for your participation and contribution, to our panelists, to the participants who stayed with us until this time. And for now, I think we just close, and we would like to make sure that the report is available for download online. Presentation will be made available if the colleagues are fine with that. And we look forward for a continuous engagement with the STEPI and with all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.